Yeah.
You are an expert at that.
Yeah. I know my cheese.
And I have been there, and it was very tasty.
And do we export quite a... By the way, speaking of food, Nikki, actually a panellist, Nikki Bazant, says... a bit way off about Coke and milk. Under no labelling system would Coke come out better than milk. Also, in the 60s, we had massively high rates of death from heart disease. So that's Nikki there. But I want to talk about cheese and how we export to Mexico. How much do we have quite
I don't know the actual numbers.
But we do?
We used to. I think it's dropped a bit in the last few years. I think we got locked out after NAFTA, which is now called whatever, UMCA or whatever they've come up with a new name for it.
Queso. No more queso. Right, okay.
On a final note with Penny Ashton and Andrew Hoggard of this afternoon, one I've been wanting to get to, and that is a Los Angeles Times article had looked at the lost art of listening and reminisced about the days when we would put on a record and listen to songs without any other distractions. It points out that nowadays we are constantly scrolling through social media feeds and online articles, hasn't that been the theme today, relegating deep listening, as they call it, to the sidelines. And Andrew, this gave me a few memories of when I was actually sort of in my late teens, early 20s, when I would actually put on an LP, sit back, look at the clouds and partake in that art of deep listening. And it occurred to me I haven't done that for years. When was the last time you put on a record and deep listened?
Well, the drive down here, I had the MP3 player hooked up.
Do you know what I mean,
never something I've really done that much. I'm more of a read a book type of person if I just want to zone out from the world.
Okay.
I'm going to be controversial here. I found that whole article deeply twatty. It was deeply twatty. Yeah, it was like, oh my God, if you want to sit down and listen to a record, off you go. I would rather stab out my eyes. It would be so boring. My husband does it all the time. He doesn't like to call it a man cave, but it's a bloody man cave. He's got lots of albums that he said, look, I've just got a single from Denmark. I'll try it. And then he brought it up on Spotify so I could listen to it. I'm like, or you could have just done that rather than getting the single from Denmark. But he sits down and he puts them on and he sits there and listens and he loves it, and that's wonderful. But I could not think of anything more boring. I love music, but I'm painting or I'm like doing something just not just sitting and listening. I would hate that.
You've never done it before. You're looking at the album sleeve cover. You've got your Genesis prog rock.
No, but I used to like looking at CDs the ones that had the lyrics in. Do you remember that was like a bonanza in the 90s?
Yes.
I spent a lot of time at the HMV listening post in Piccadilly Circus, I will say, when I was on my OE, listening to which ones I wanted, but I wouldn't just take them home and just sit and listen to them. No.
Isn't that what we need to get back to, though, Andrew? That idea of, speaking of great music, listen to this. Wow.
You've got an invisible touch, Wallace. You reach right in and grab right hold of my heart. See, that's creepy, isn't it?
On that note, the wonderful Emile Donovan is taking over tomorrow on the way. But I'm going to leave you with this lovely, lovely track. Thank you, Brad. And Andrew Hoggard, the new president of Fed Farmers.
Congratulations.
Penny Ashton. Great to have you on the program.
Thank you very much.
I'm back Monday. See you then. Checkpoint next. Thanks to my producers. Talk later.
She has a built-in ability to take everything she sees, and now it seems I'm falling for her. She seems to have invisible touch. She reaches in and grabs my holding your heart. She seems to have invisible touch. It takes control.
Kei te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere ake nei, the political revolving door has been spinning furiously today with resignations and resurrections. David Clark's out, Chris Hipkins is in, and Simon Bridges is back, leapfrogging his way up the party list. We'll talk to the Health Minister, the new one, and the National Party leader Todd Muller is joining us live. Double dippers, why tens of thousands of people have claimed government wage subsidies twice. There's fears for the mental health of seasonal workers from the Pacific Islands stuck in Hawke's Bay because of the pandemic, and free dry cleaning, a monster room service menu and 5-star hotels in some cases. Is that isolation or extravagance? Don't forget, you can check us out on Facebook.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata with DNA. Hotels being used as isolation facilities have been booked out by the government until December. Air Commodore Digby Webb, who's in charge of border management, says exclusive use contracts have been signed with the hotels for the next 6 months. The government is now looking at Queenstown and Dunedin as potential locations for managed isolation. The minister responsible, Megan Woods, will visit both places with Air Commodore Webb next week to investigate their feasibility. She says several factors will need to be looked into.
Some of this is about how we can work with the DHB and whether there's capacity in terms of health in that area, because we know that Queenstown doesn't have a hospital, for example.
Megan Woods says they will talk to locals on the ground about what their concerns may be. The United States has recorded more than 50,000 COVID-19 cases in a 24-hour period, its highest daily toll since the pandemic began. At least 5 states, Arizona, California, North Carolina, Tennessee and Texas, reported record high numbers of new cases today. California's Governor Gavin Newsom has reintroduced some lockdown measures that were being progressively lifted. He's urging people to keep taking the pandemic seriously.
Please, I say this respectfully, disabuse yourself that somehow people are no longer dying. There's also real evidence, and that's the 110 lives, family members that won't be celebrating 4th of July weekend with their loved ones.
Dining in Californian restaurants will be banned and cinemas, bars and museums closed for at least 3 weeks. The newly appointed Health Minister Chris Hipkins is confident he's up to the job. Mr Hipkins, already the Education Minister, has replaced David Clark, who has resigned, saying he doesn't want to be a distraction from the government's COVID-19 response. Nationals Deputy Leader Nikki Kaye has expressed scepticism about Mr Hipkins' ability to juggle both health and education. He says while he doesn't have any health sector experience, he'll give the portfolio his all.
I have an experience working in a big operational portfolio that has a lot of complexity. I didn't have any experience working in the education portfolio when I became the Minister of Education.
Chris Hipkins. Meanwhile, residents spoken to by RNZ and Dr Clark's Dunedin South electorate have welcomed his resignation. One local, Michael, says he leaves behind an unremarkable legacy.
Well, I'm not quite sure really what he's achieved over that period of time, so it's hard to comment. I think obviously we've got a Dunedin hospital coming up, but that was announced by the prior government. Really not sure what he's achieved, to be frank.
Dr Clark has held the seat since 2011 and won it by more than 11,000 votes at the last election. He says he intends to stand again this year. Seasonal workers stuck in Hawke's Bay because of the pandemic are suffering from depression and anxiety because they cannot get home. More than 1,500 workers from the Pacific due to return home in May are still in the region as the government's worry they may bring the virus home. The operations manager for Johnny Appleseed in Hastings, Len Thompson, says the mental health of 117 Samoan employees is now the firm's biggest concern.
There's depression, there's anxiety, there's anger, and the problem is there's no day. It's not like they can say, oh, it's another 2 weeks away or whatever. There's no day currently.
Len Thompson says breaches at managed isolation facilities in this country have hampered talks with Samoan authorities on bringing the workers home. In breaking news, the government agency investigating the use of public money for the America's Cup has suspended all further payments to its events arm, while claims of financial mismanagement are investigated. 4 alpacas have been fatally injured in their paddock in the North Canterbury town of Waikari. The Hurunui District Council is seeking information about the attack, which happened sometime between Sunday and Monday morning. It says a resident found 3 of his alpacas dead and a 4th so badly hurt it had to be put down. All the injuries were to their skulls. It's coming up to 4.5 minutes past 5. The first Warriors player is returning to New Zealand. Levaha Pulu is coming home from Australia for family reasons. Pulu's pregnant wife has been involved in a car crash in Auckland, and while her condition is not serious, he has opted to leave the Warriors camp on New South Wales Central Coast. Clay Wilson has more.
Levaha Pulu is one of 3 players, along with David Fusitua and Ken Maumalo, who last week expressed their desire to come home, with the NRL still unable to get exemptions for the players' families to enter Australia. The exemptions were promised to the Warriors by the NRL before the Auckland club agreed to relocate across the Tasman. The Warriors have given the NRL an ultimatum, saying they have until July 19th to get the exemptions, with the 3 players agreeing to stay on until then. The NRL has given the Warriors clearance to bring in another loan player to cover the departure of Pulu. This is Clay Wilson.
England rugby are stalking Blues number 8 Hoskin Sortutu. The Telegraph newspaper says coach Eddie Jones is interested in Sortutu, who's the son of former Blues and Fiji wing Waisake Sortutu, and whose English mother makes him eligible to play for New Zealand, Fiji or England. The man once dubbed New Zealand's Mr. Softball. Let me start that again. The man once dubbed New Zealand's Mr. Softball has died at 83. Bill Massey was a pitcher in the New Zealand team that came third in the inaugural World Championships in Mexico City in 1966, and he also played in the 1968 World Champs in Oklahoma City. That's the news.
Finding the truth. It's our obligation to make sure that those sort of serious allegations are thoroughly and professionally and independently investigated. Finding in a victim's favour.
I told my truth and now I've been vindicated, and it's an amazing feeling.
Finding a cannonball.
Well, you could bowl it down Drew's Avenue and see how long it lasted, but I think the best thing would be to x-ray it, and the bomb squad are the best people to do that.
An explosive start to your day. Morning reports weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northern half of the North Island from Taranaki and Taupo northwards, including Bay of Plenty. Mainly fine, but a few showers north of Auckland tonight. Morning frosts in sheltered places. South Taranaki and Taihape to Kapiti, showers with snow to 800 metres inland, clearing tomorrow morning. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, showers with snow above 700 metres, easing today, then clearing tomorrow. Gale or severe gale southerlies, slowly easing. For Wellington and Wairarapa, showers clearing tomorrow morning and strong cold southerlies easing. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland, fine with morning frosts. North and mid-Canterbury, showers becoming confined to Banks Peninsula tonight. Fine tomorrow with morning frosts. For South Canterbury, Otago, Southland and Fiordland, fine with overnight frosts, some severe inland. Scattered rain developing late tomorrow about Fiordland and western parts of Southland and Otago. Chatham Islands, showers and strong cold southerlies easing tomorrow. RNZ National. It's 7.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Let's begin tonight with that breaking news Susanna mentioned in the bulletin. MB has confirmed it has stopped all public funding to the America's Cup organisers as it investigates allegations of misspending. Now, the statement that has been released by the General Manager of Tourism from MB, Ian Cossar, says while Crown and Council work through this process regarding the claims made relating to the organisation of the 36th America's Cup, we are not intending to make further payments to America's Cup Events Limited. This will be revisited pending the outcome of the process. $40 million has been set aside for the event fee for America's Cup to date, and $29 million has been paid to ACE in line with contractual funding milestones. Statement goes on to say this process is ongoing. There are contractual agreements in place as to not undermine the current process, to protect commercial sensitivity and to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation. We are unable to go into further detail at this time. We will provide an update when more information is available. So there you have it. They've suspended payments at the moment to the America's Cup Events Limited Group. And we will bring you more on this developing story throughout the program. Also coming up on Checkpoint, we can reveal more than 40,000 people have received wage subsidy payouts from more than one employer, and several hundred people have got the payout from 4 employers or more. That story's coming up, but we begin tonight with political comings and goings on both sides of the House. National leader Todd Muller brought Simon Bridges, the man he ousted, back today after 6 weeks in the dark. Todd Muller will join us live shortly, but as Simon Bridges was brought back into the fold, David Clark was literally gone by lunchtime. Mr Clark has formally resigned from the job after both he and the Prime Minister concluded he's become too much of a distraction to the government's pandemic response. Our political reporter Katie Scotcher was there when Mr Clark delivered the news.
This morning I have formally tendered my resignation as Minister of Health.
It was almost inevitable, David Clark stepping down after a number of major missteps.
It has become increasingly clear to me that my continuation in the role is distracting from the government's overall response to COVID-19.
The distractions started back in early April as the number of COVID-19 cases here peaked. Mr Clark repeatedly flouted level 4 lockdown rules, taking his family to the beach and then driving to a mountain bike track.
In hindsight, all I can think is, what an idiot.
At the time, Mr Clark offered his resignation. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, said under normal conditions she would sack Mr Clark, but instead demoted him because of the enormity of the job at hand. And as life here returned to normal, pressure on the former minister mounted, this time over botch-ups at the border, which he initially refused to accept responsibility for. Then there was that viral video filmed last week, Mr Clark directing blame for the failures to the Director General of Health as Ashley Bloomfield stood quietly in the background.
The Director General has accepted that the protocol wasn't being followed. He has accepted responsibility for that and has set about putting it right.
Speaking to reporters on Friday, Ms Ardern was asked whether after the week's events, David Clark would remain as Health Minister up until the September election.
Of course, that is what I've continued to say. And one thing, that I will acknowledge, there will be some weeks that are better than others. And what's most important is that we continue to work together collectively alongside the likes of the expertise of Dr Bloomfield, alongside the Health Minister and alongside our whole team.
Ms Ardern was today asked if she was simultaneously discussing Mr Clark's future behind closed doors.
Last week, I had a discussion with the Minister around some of issues that were getting in the way of our ability to really focus in on COVID-19. And the Minister came to the conclusion yesterday that, in his view, that meant he could no longer continue in the role.
Mr Clark's government colleagues also convinced it was the right move.
He's done a great job in terms of the team and in terms of his commitment, so just congratulate him on his effort.
I think it was the right thing for him to do.
I feel sorry for him and his family.
Look, he's made his judgment. I think he's made it for the right reasons. He's been a very good health minister.
Yes, he made the right call.
Look, I'm not responsible for the Prime Minister's choice of ministers. I'm responsible for the choice of my own ministers, and they're a sea of stability at this point in time, as you all well know.
Education Minister Chris Hipkins will have responsibility for the health portfolio reins until the election.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health, whom I welcome to the portfolio.
And his new job starts now.
Mr Speaker, I'm advised by the Ministry of Health no.
It's the first time in almost a century a minister has juggled both portfolios. The last MP to do so was the former Prime Minister Peter Fraser in 1935.
This is a decision that I've made for this period, and then I will reassess at the election, because I absolutely have at the front of my mind the importance of both portfolios currently being held by Minister Hipkins.
National's Deputy Leader Nikki Kay isn't convinced Mr Hipkins will be able to juggle them both.
New Zealanders need to have absolute confidence that the health portfolio, given the bungles that have occurred around border management, is being managed well, and it shouldn't just be a caretaker situation. We need heavy lifting in health, and I'm not confident that Chris Hipkins will be able to do that with both education and health.
Mr Clark will stay on at Parliament with the hope of being re-elected as the MP for Dunedin North at the upcoming election. But the Prime Minister today made it clear David Clark will not be reappointed as the Minister of Health if the government is re-elected. Atu i te whare parimata mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Katie Scott Shiraho.
Few supporters could be found in David Clark's electorate of Dunedin today, a seat he won by more than 11,000 votes in the last election. Labour has held the seat for decades, with Dr Clark at the helm since 2011. Our reporter Tess Brunton hit the streets in his electorate to find out what voters think of his resignation and whether they'll welcome him back for another term.
Michael has met David Clark a few times while living in his electorate. He says he's a nice guy, but not up to the job of Health Minister.
Well, I'm not quite sure really what he's achieved over that period of time, so it's hard to comment. I think obviously we've got a Dunedin hospital coming up, but that was announced by the prior government. Really not sure what he's achieved, to be frank.
Michael says the Prime Minister should have sacked him ages ago.
Just wondering why the Prime Minister is so incapable of actually holding anyone to account. Why isn't the Prime Minister actually sacking these people that are underperforming rather than waiting for them to resign? So we've got a record of continuous, people not being held accountable for doing the jobs that they're voted in to do and elected to do. It's just unbelievable.
Dunedin resident James is unhappy to hear about the resignation.
I don't like to think of someone who's worked as hard as he has resigning. Yeah, it seems to me a waste of human resource.
He says Dr Clark supported the Prime Minister with confidence, diplomacy and workmanship. In the last election, David Clark received 21,000, or about 58% of the valid votes, in the now renamed Dunedin North seat. Glenda is one of those voters.
Everybody else had to lock down and almost you felt like you were, the only thing missing on your leg was the little ankle bracelet when we stayed at home, and so if it's good enough for everybody else, it certainly should have been creating an example for everyone because he was the health minister.
Even as a staunch Labour supporter, she says it's time for some fresh blood.
I think it's probably time to put someone else in, actually. I am a Labour supporter, but my opinion of David Clark's sort of gone downhill a wee bit, over his performance.
One Dunedin woman who asked not to be named was pleased to hear of his resignation.
I'm really happy that he decided to step up and take ownership of that, being the health minister. I think the buck stops with him and he should have been more involved in the whole handling and outlook of how it all went down, and I'm glad that he's finally taken some accountability.
She wasn't against seeing his name back on the ballot.
I think it's brave considering what's happened over the last 8 to 10 weeks.
One student based in his electorate says David Clark's mistakes shouldn't dismiss the work he's done during the pandemic. He was prepared to give Dr Clark his vote if he owns up to his behaviour during lockdown.
I've met him, I've met his kids. He's definitely not a hard, arrogant dickhead. At least definitely in the electorate, I think that's definitely a good thing because it's very easy for politicians to be very curt, I guess. I think we definitely need more people who can be actual people in politics, and that's good.
Dunedin resident Alice says David Clark's actions didn't serve the nation well over lockdown.
Twice he bailed on lockdown that everybody else was deep in, and I really didn't like the way he threw Ashley Bloomfield under the bus. I come back 3 days before our lockdown here, and I come back from Italy. I think New Zealand did an amazing job, and I think he really needed to pull his head in and actually take a bit more responsibility.
Tina lives in the neighbouring electorate of Taieri. She wanted to see Dr Clark gone weeks ago, saying he needed to practice what he preached during lockdown.
I don't think he's been up front. He didn't make himself visible, and he should have been primarily visible over the lockdown period, being the Minister of Health. And he just, to me, wasn't there.
Tina says he should reconsider standing for MP again.
For some people, I know that Dunedin are very strong Labour supporters here, but I'm sure it's time to sort of rethink who you're actually electing into Parliament. And a track record, you have to look at track records. He's progressed as far as he can go. He won't go any further.
With the general election only months away, time will tell whether he'll have another chance to represent Dunedin voters. In Dunedin for Checkpoint, Cortes Brunton, TNA.
Well, what a day in politics, eh? Simon Bridges has boomeranged back into National's top 20 today, taking the Foreign Affairs portfolio off senior MP Jerry Brownlee. The reshuffle was prompted by Paula Bennett's resignation on Monday, with the Upper Harbour MP vacating the number 13 spot on the list. Dr Shane Reti moves into that position and also takes on the Associate Drug Reform portfolio. The jump makes him the party's highest-ranked Māori MP. And while former leader Simon Bridges gets the big name portfolio, he's still low down the list at number 17. National Party leader Todd Muller joins me now. Good evening, Mr Muller.
Good evening, Lisa. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Have you just plugged the National Party leak with the Foreign Affairs portfolio?
Not at all. delighted actually to be able to put that opportunity in front of Simon. It was clearly a role that he was interested in, requested it, and with Paula's departure, it provided an opportunity for me to obviously promote Shane, and I'm delighted for him. I think he's going to be a big player in the New Zealand political scene, and of course, give opportunity for Simon to be Foreign Affairs spokesperson, and Lisa, he'll do that job very, very well.
If you thought he was right for the role, why didn't you give it to him 6 weeks ago? What's changed?
Well, look, at the time, as I said, when I landed my final list, I was under the impression at the time that he was, reflecting on what happens next, and obviously he made it clear, and I'm delighted that he has, actually, that he wants to stay as an MP. He's made that very determined decision.
He wanted Foreign Affairs or nothing, didn't he? You offered him justice. He didn't want it. He wanted Foreign Affairs or nothing. He dug his toes in, and now you've given him what he wanted.
Well, I think the opportunity's presented itself, of course, with Paula moving on, and what a great contribution she's made to New Zealand politics, and no doubt will in her next chapter of her life. But look, you deal with what's in front of you, Lisa, and with that opportunity to promote, of course, Shane, and to give Simon a job that, of course, he wants, but more critically, will actually hold the Minister of Foreign Affairs to account, and I can't wait to see that.
Was Jerry Brownlee not up to that?
Of course he was.
So then why swap him out?
Well, because you make judgments around, how to frame up your team in the context of a small minor reshuffle. Cherry's got a lot on in terms of obviously shadow leader of the House, but particularly he's running our campaign. We've got 10 weeks to go there, Lisa. So for me, it was an opportunity to reflect. Simon's got a huge amount to offer, and I took the moment about to give him that opportunity.
So Foreign Affairs, held by someone at number 17 on the list, does that really reflect the mana of the portfolio?
Simon reflects the mana of the portfolio. And
then why is he at 17?
Well, I think there's a lot of focus on what the numbers are this side of the election. I mean, we've got a campaign to run. We're a team of 55, which, you've heard me say it before, but frankly, best the other side. When you have a health minister resign and the portfolio gets given to an education minister who's already run off his feet, that's their problem. They've got no depth. We've got depth. We're going to run hard to the election, and we'll see who's in what seat at the end of it.
Is this a case of keep your enemies close to you?
No, not at all. I mean, Simon and I mean, look, clearly, I challenged for the leadership. That was robust, but we have a professional relationship. We're side by side in the same city. So, look, we don't need to worry about that. We certainly know how to work together for the good of this country, and you'll see that demonstrated in spades over the next few years. Just
before we move on, what is it that Dr. Shane Reti has to do to get on the front bench? You do know he's an actual doctor.
Yeah, I do, but the opportunity, there was a minor reshuffle, right? We're 10 weeks out from an election, running hard, and I had the opportunity to replace 13, the position that Paula had. And I've always signalled, indeed you would have seen that when I made my announcement of, when I became leader and stood for the first time in front of New Zealand, I had Shane just to the right of me. He came in with me in 2014. I rate him highly. I was delighted to be able to put him to number 13. And again, Lisa, let's, once this election's done, if I have the privilege of leading this great country, we'll see who sits in what seat then.
OK, earlier this week you queried whether returning New Zealanders need to quarantine at all. You said if they could prove they were COVID-free by taking a test before they got there, maybe they shouldn't have to go into quarantine. Can you explain to me exactly how that would work?
No, and so that's what I was framing up was a criteria that could exist in the future when clearly that can't happen in a current context, and I never was...
Oh, so are you backing away from that now, that suggestion that maybe they didn't need to be tested?
No, let me, if you wouldn't mind. What I was talking about was a critique of the government's lack of transparency or visibility around what the next step is in terms of, in the medium term, opening up our border. There is no appetite from me or any New Zealander for the border to be opened up today. partly because of what's happening in other countries and partly because of our schmozzle domestically. But we can't stay locked up forever, and it's a very fair question, I think, to ask of the government.
It's
So
a
what
fair
does it look
question
like?
to ask of you, Mr Muller, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to talk about your policies and what you would do, because you say the other team is not doing this correctly. So what would you do? I mean, some of the feedback we've had and questions with people knowing you were coming on, this person says, too much sniping from Todd Muller, not enough policy. If he was government, what exactly would he do with the Trans-Tasman bubble? What would it look like? So here's your chance. How would you do it?
Well, right now, we'd be completely locked up. I'm not suggesting any other change from that.
So no
but
different to
what
the
I-
current government then? You're no different. Your policy would be no different.
What I am trying to frame up here is what does the medium term look like as the pressure reduces in Australia and as they get their COVID situation under control, which clearly they haven't done in Victoria, and so that would need to happen. What I am framing up is, so what does that opening up look like? What is the best health advice suggesting that would be? Is it a COVID test in Australia before you hop on a plane? And if you had a COVID test that was free, of course, in Australia before you hopped on a plane, what then would the quarantine requirements be in this country? I'm not the health expert, Lisa, but I think it is a very fair question to ask of the government, who is doing the thinking as to what that medium-term scenario
Again,
looks
I'm
like,
asking
to
you
share
what
it
your
with them.
policies would be around a Trans-Tasman bubble. So you're saying you wouldn't go now. When would you go?
Well, again, you have to take your health advice, but we have no visibility of what that health advice looks like in terms of the medium term. And that, I think, and I repeat, I think is a very fair question to ask. I mean, clearly you're going to need no community transmission in the country itself. You're going to need superb track and trace capability, both in that country and of course, in New Zealand. But what does it look like in terms of the border management, in terms of testing in Australia and then testing in New Zealand? In my view, and I would assume that the health experts will get to this point as well, and I will wait to see, is that when you get the pressure low in one country, and we're happy with the test regime and the equivalence regime that exists in that country, I would assume the advice would be that we would be able to move away from a 14-day two-test regime. But I'm not the expert. I'm simply asking for what the advice is. And I think that's a fair question, Lisa. I genuinely do.
Can you tell us a bit about your other policy? What's the delay with announcing any other policy? Are you radically overhauling National's policy positions? Is that why nothing's coming out at the moment?
Well, I mean, for a start, it's not that nothing has come out. I've made a number of announcements, particularly in terms of supporting businesses to get themselves back up off their feet. But I've got a speech next week, which
right. So
I'm
cash
sure you'll be interested
for
in.
jobs. What other policies have you got? Welfare policy. When can we expect that?
Oh, look, I know I can assure there's a lot in the can, but we're 10 weeks out and I want to make sure we sequence it in the right way.
Okay.
I've got a speech next week, which I'm sure you'll be interested in, and a number of series of announcements after that planned. Lisa.
Okay, so when you say there's a lot in the can, you've decided these policies already, you're just releasing them, staging the release of them. Is that what you're saying?
Yep. Well, it ends up, look, Elise, it ends up being a bit of both. You know,
No, well, is the policy formulated or not at this point, or are you still working on it?
There are certainly some that are being finalised, and there's some that have been finalised. And, you know, it's important from my perspective that we sequence the announcement of those in a way that works best for us, and that's what I intend to do.
So what policies have you sorted? You don't have to tell me what they are, but which ones are in the can?
I'm not going to go through that with you on afternoon radio.
You can't even tell us what policies you've decided on. Forget the content of the policy, just the ones that you're in agreement on and they're ready to go.
No, I'm not going there because it's.
Is that because you don't have them?
No, not at all, Lisa. You can be assured that we do, but we work on our time frame in terms of when we release it, and I'm sure when I do, you'll be delighted to interview me about them.
I know you've got to go soon, but you've been to Te Rapa, the old pack house. You've been to the Wellington Chamber of Commerce. You've been to the Hawke's Bay Chamber of Commerce. When are you going to start visiting and talking to people who would not normally vote for National?
Look, I think you need to come travelling with me.
So you're at field days now, are you, or heading to field days?
I'm waiting outside it, yes, because I'm late for that.
Are you booked in to go to the Avondale markets or Otara markets, or when are you going to be heading to South Auckland?
Oh, you should see my diary. It's quite something. I'm enjoying my connection with New Zealand. It's a diverse country, and the feedback's fantastic. It's going to be a really interesting 10 weeks.
Appreciate your time. That is the National Party leader, Todd Muller. And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, MB has confirmed it stopped all public funding to America's Cup organisers as it investigates allegations of misspending. In the past few minutes, Emirates Team New Zealand has released a statement. It says it supports the government in holding funds until the process is complete and we have closed out all issues. Authorities in Australia investigate reports security guards slept with quarantining guests at hotels in the state of Victoria. And a recent returnee in a managed isolation hotel says they're too extravagant. We'd love your feedback. Do get in touch this evening. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. We're keen to hear your views on the departure of the Health Minister, the new Health Minister, Chris Hipkins, and the reshuffle within National. But it's time now for the headlines with Susanna.
The government has stopped funding the America's Cup while it investigates claims about the management of public funds for the event. The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment says 3/4 of the $40 million set aside has already been paid out. Team New Zealand denies any wrongdoing. Hotels being used as isolation facilities have been booked out by the government until the end of the year. Head of Border Management, Air Commodore Digby Webb, says contracts have been signed for the exclusive use of the hotels for the next 6 months. The government is also considering Queenstown and Dunedin as potential locations for managed isolation. The Electoral Commission is destroying millions of brochures printed for the end-of-life choice referendum after one item was accidentally printed in a bold font. Destroying and reprinting the brochures and enrolment packs will cost about $1 million. All the material had to be destroyed as it wasn't possible to isolate which packs contained one mistakenly highlighted answer to the referendum question. Seasonal workers stuck in Hawke's Bay because of the pandemic are suffering from depression and anxiety because they cannot get home. More than 1,500 workers from the Pacific who should have returned home in May are still in the region, as their governments fear they may bring the virus back with them. The TVNZ building in Auckland was evacuated this afternoon after a fire alarm went off and channels 1 and 2 were briefly off air. TVNZ says the cause is still being investigated, but there is no active fire. The Desert Road has reopened after closing last night because of heavy snow. The Napier to Taihape Road was also reopened this afternoon, but is expected to close again at dusk. Meanwhile, winds of up to 120 kilometres an hour forecast for Hawke's Bay and Gisborne could damage trees and bring down power lines. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. And it's business o'clock right now. Time for the business news with Nona Peltier. Kathmandu. Nona, let's start with that company. It expects full-year profits to be down and is pretty cautious. What's going on?
Yeah, well, it's going to be down. So they made about $100 million in underlying earnings last year. This year, they're expecting that to be about $70 million, which is still a pretty good result. But you know, they had a difficult period because of the lockdown. So their sales were down 15% to the 10 months ending, 12 months, 11 months ending May, because their financial year is June, right? That's their balance date.
They're travelling gear, aren't they? They're all sort of go into the wilderness or here's your backpack or whatever. If you can't go travelling.
Well, even still, though, after the lockdown, their Rip Curl products, there was a strong rebound in that, 21% increase. So that was a good lift, and 12% for Kathmandu. But they are worried about the slower number of people through their stores, which isn't surprising, I suppose, but because they rely so much on tourists and they're not around. And so the medium-term outlook for the company is not great. They're a little bit cautious. But you know what? I mean, it's still a pretty profitable company. And so the market liked the update. The share price rose 11% today. So, yeah, overall, company's still doing pretty well.
Interesting.
Despite the cautious outlook.
Okay, so we've talked about jobs in recent days. Number of job ads is improving, you say, but pretty well down on what they were pre-COVID levels. So what's improving?
Okay, so what's improving is jobs for medical staff. And that's not surprising. Also, I was just looking through the list. Some of them like for farming animals and conservation. So that's interesting. We know that there's been a lot of jobs in that area because the government's looking to help, say, for example, people find work.
The wild wallabies. Yeah, or kill wallabies.
Is that right? Well,
wallaby eradication.
I don't see that here. Wallaby eradication is not on the list, but certainly health services are, and they've returned to near normal. But overall, it's a 57% of where we were pre-COVID. So 57% of the jobs. And some of the jobs certainly have not recovered, and they're half where they were before. So administrative jobs, there's not very much going on with that. And so there's a lot of other sectors which are lagging behind. So it's not exactly back to normal, but at least it's heading in the right direction.
Okay, what are the numbers looking like on the market today?
Yeah, they're pretty stellar, to be honest. We've got the index, the top 50 index. It rose 1.3% today. So we're at 11. That's a 152-point gain.
So 50 points basically up on yesterday, wasn't it? 100 points down, wasn't it?
And then the day before that, it was like the opposite. So we've been a pretty choppy week. So we're at 11,502. And partly that's because we were just following along from Wall Street, and that was pretty good overnight. There's still all this concern about the spread of the virus, but at the same time, people are really hopeful that there's going to be a vaccine, which will make the economy bump up. So, but I wouldn't put too much into this. I think we're going to see choppy sessions for a while. The dollar was stronger, 64.9 US cents, which is better than we've seen for a while, 93.8 cents Australian, and steady against the pence at 51.9.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with our business wrap. More than 40,000 people have received wage subsidy payouts from more than one employer, with several hundred people getting the payout from 4 employers or more. The Ministry for Social Development says many of those payments include part-time work, and unions say it's evidence of New Zealand's increasing reliance on the gig economy. But critics want the payments to be looked at very closely, with Super Rugby players among those getting double payouts. Nita Blake-Person reports.
The government's wage subsidy scheme has helped cover nearly 1.7 million jobs at a cost of nearly $12 billion. But that payout doesn't cover 1.7 million people, with tens of thousands of people working in multiple jobs receiving multiple payouts. Information released to Checkpoint shows 42,200 people have been paid out by 2 employers. 2,200 of those had 3 employers, and 364 employees were linked to 4 employers or more. Jared here is the National Secretary for the Unite Union and says it shows how many New Zealanders need more than one gig to get by.
I was in an Uber shortly after the lockdown, and the Uber driver had a job and received a subsidy because he wasn't working. Also his Uber business, because they were contractors, he received a subsidy. So, there'll be lots and lots of people like that who've got part-time businesses who would have been hit hard, who've also got jobs. We've got lots of members who have multiple jobs. That's not unusual at all. Simply to make ends meet, because people just can't, a lot of people want to work 40 hours or even more sometimes, but the jobs that they can get simply don't allow that to happen.
And he says underemployment, where workers struggle to get enough hours, is a real problem for many employees.
In this case, it's probably worked to the advantage. It would be one of the few times. But if you're working part-time and you try to get income support from ones that very much works against you, the rates for doing a little bit of work, more than a few hours work, the clawback rates around 70, 90%, after a while you actually know better off. We discourage people from taking up work that's available.
The wage subsidy was paid directly to eligible employers at a flat rate of $585.80 for people working 20 hours or more per week, and $350 for anyone working less than 20 hours per week. The New Zealand Rugby Union has confirmed its players, who are employees of both New Zealand Rugby and the provincial unions, receive the full-time rate from both organisations. Scott Mason is a tax accountant at Dunedin firm Findex. He says even receiving multiple payouts, it's unlikely people profited from the scheme.
It's possible that at an individual level there might be people who got $50 more a week than they would have otherwise, simply because there were 2 lots of wage subsidy being paid to them by 2 employers. But that's absolutely in the margins. At an employer level, absolutely not. And for the vast majority of the 42,000 odd people that received it from 2 employers, the 585 times 2 is probably less than they would have received anyway.
But tax researcher Dr Michael Goumet, who's been a vocal critic of the scheme, says some payouts may require a closer look.
It does seem to be, looking at the numbers, that there's a lot of people out there that have had subsidies claimed on their behalf. So the question really is, this is a taxpayer cost. It's going to be borne by a lot of people for a long time to repay these taxpayer funds over time back to the government, so to speak. But I think it does raise the question, is this all legitimate above board? And as I say, doing an interim spot audit on a few to see whether they are legit, and then taking it wider if you do find discrepancies.
The Ministry for Social Development says it's aware of the potential risk associated with employees being claimed by multiple workplaces, and it's part of its audit program. So far, there have been nearly 6,000 refunds made to the wage subsidy program, worth $176 million. The largest payout to date is Silver Fern Farms, who paid back the $42 million they initially claimed. For Checkpoint, Nita Blakeperson.
It is 20 to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Get in touch about anything you've heard on the program this evening. Let us know your thoughts on the change of Health Minister and the reshuffle within National Party as well. Simon Bridges back in the fold there, or anything else that's on your mind this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Authorities in Australia are investigating reports security guards slept with quarantining guests at hotels in the state of Victoria. The state's Premier, Daniel Andrews, says there were breaches among staff at the hotels, which he believes may have led to the outbreaks. Meanwhile, around 300,000 people in more than 30 Melbourne suburbs are living under lockdown again. There have been 77 new infections in the state today. As the ABC's Rachel Mealy reports, there's growing questions and anger about breaches in hotel quarantine.
As Victoria grapples with the coronavirus clusters, new claims are emerging about the hotel quarantine fiasco that's been linked to one of the biggest outbreaks. The Herald Sun's reporting that security guards slept with some of the people in quarantine and were also caught sleeping on the job. The Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt was asked about the claims on Channel 7.
If those statements are true, that would be completely and utterly unacceptable, and we would encourage the Victorian authorities to throw the book at them if any of these individuals or the firms have behaved inappropriately. Right now, there will be a judicial inquiry, and we welcome that, we endorse that.
For tourism operators across Victoria, the latest lockdowns are another headache. Christine Adams owns the Marysville Caravan and Holiday Park.
In the past few days, there's still been a lot of confusion of are we in a hotspot area or not? And so we're right on the edge. Should we be coming? Shouldn't we be coming? We've now just with the announcement of the postcodes, we've been saying if you're in that postcode, you can't come. It's helped to make it a lot clearer for us in understanding what they can and can't do.
She says she's given refunds to customers who've been forced to cancel their travel plans. Now the Victorian government has announced a $5 million fund to reimburse tourism operators who face cancelled bookings as a result of the latest lockdown rules. Christine Adams is relieved.
That will certainly be very helpful to a lot of businesses where it's been a huge struggle over the last few months, obviously. And for a business like ours, we were closed down for completely, 100% for 3 months. And we had to give it an awful lot of refunds back when that original close down happened. And then over the last week or so, again, it's been happening because of people being in hotspot areas.
Felicia Mariani is the Chief Executive of the Victoria Tourism Industry Council. She says tourist sites and accommodation providers are still bound by the 20-person limit, and this is causing distress to some businesses.
Many of those operators can't really function
on a cap of 20. They needed to get to that 50 to make the model viable for them to open. And when we were unable to move to 50, that was a big blow for a lot of the industry. It's been to say it's been a difficult and challenging time is just really an understatement.
She'd like to see the rules allow for a 2-speed recovery to allow some tourism operators to get back on their feet.
We've been talking in all of our discussions with government and talked about previously the need to look at a bit of a 2-speed easing of restrictions. We do have many of our regional areas across the state that have really seen little or no impact from coronavirus in terms of infections, of course. So in those areas where, again, we've been talking through our discussions with government about the chance to look at the easing of some of those restrictions at potentially different levels than what's happening in Melbourne or the Greater Melbourne region.
And that was Felicia Mariani ending that report from the ABC's Rachel Mealy. Back home now, in our managed isolation hotels are too posh and returnees should not be treated like hotel guests with luxuries like free menu choices and dry cleaning. That's the verdict from New Zealand woman Tony Foster, who has returned to the country to take up a job and has spent the past 11 days in isolation at Ellersly's Novotel Hotel. Tony told me she had expected to return to isolation accommodation similar to the container village after the Christchurch earthquakes, not a free 4 or 5-star hotel, which she says some returnees are treating as a holiday. She told me returnees should not be treated like hotel guests because they're not paying a cent to be there.
To me, the whole thing feels like an experiment. They're very, very soft, the way they're managing the people. I expected a completely different experience. There wasn't much you could get online, so you couldn't really mentally prepare. So I sort of prepared for like a boot camp, karate camp type situation where it would be hard. There would be limited luxuries. It would be really managed. I expected it to be at that, me struggling with the whole, like it's just so hard. I honestly I didn't realise it would be like a holiday.
So how posh is isolation, Tony? How posh is it?
Well, it's too posh. People are like, I'll give you an example. Last night there was a gentleman, there's a line that you're not allowed, we've all known since March that all offices, anywhere there's a line, you're not meant to lean on counters. So this big fat American guy was leaning on the counter, and the receptionist, because the receptionists are treating the guests like we're hotel guests, they're not standing up to these people. So I said to him, excuse me, there's a line. You're not meant to be leaning on the counter. Everyone knows that. That's why there's a line there. And he goes, oh. I said, so you need to step back and respect the lady's space. And she didn't know how to manage him. And then later on, you're not allowed in the restaurant area. And later on, I was just going up to the lift, and he was in the restaurant area asking for a large scotch glass. And I'm like, I said to him, you're not meant to be in there. This is our food. So they're not. It's really weird. We're getting treated really well and really softly, which is fine if you're a paying guest. But to me, if you're in a quarantine stroke managed isolation, it needs to be. We're not hotel guests. We are, you know what I mean. It's like it's weird.
So
the thing.
So are some people taking the mickey? I mean, just talk me through. So,
yes,
for example, the food options and things.
Oh my God! When you first arrive, it's a bit of a bungle getting off the plane and everything, which I thought it was run really well considering of how many people are returning. And it takes about 2 hours from the time your bus pulls up. They let 15 off each bus, and there's only 15 on our bus, so there was 3 buses. And then you line up, and it's quite good. Everyone does the social distancing. Again, there's a lack of communication. You don't know what to expect. You're told to go in and go left, which is fine. So then there's a whole lot of Ministry of Health people sitting around, and then they throw a menu at you and say, pick your meals for the next 7 days. So I'm like, and there's all these choices, and I'm like, okay, so I picked what I thought would be great. And then the next morning, an abundance of food arrived, like yogurt, fruit, waffles. They didn't order croissants, they didn't order cereal. I only ordered toast with 1 fruit. And there's a complete and utter waste amongst everybody, and everybody's talking about it. And I'm witnessing how people are just taking the staff and taking the system for advantage, taking advantage of it and complaining about the meals.
Is there a degree of extravagance being shown among the guests, Tony?
I do amongst the guests. I think there is an expectation of how they should be treated, and definitely a degree of extravagance, most definitely, which I was unprepared for. I thought we'd be doing hard time.
You say that you expected it to be tougher. By that, do you mean more regimented and people checking up on you?
Well, I expected them to be like, okay, I'm on the 5th floor. Only the 5th floor can go and exercise between 10 and 11. I didn't think it would be a free-for-all that you could go out and mix with everybody, because you've got people arriving most days. So basically, when the people arrive, from day 3, they've had their COVID test. Now, once they've had that COVID test, we still don't know whether they're negative or positive. They're allowed to mix we're all allowed to mix together. And there's people smoking and out in the smoking area, that's fine. But it's like, I expected it to be, there's no way we're all going to mix together. There's been a lot of talk amongst the travellers that everyone's surprised how lax it is.
So, Tony, if you reckon it's too posh there and too extravagant, where do you think that returnees should be put up instead?
Well, I don't have all the answers, but I lived through the Christchurch earthquake and saw pretty quickly how they knocked up a thing called the container thing. There was a quake city, it was a container city. I don't know I can't remember what they called it. I've been away a while. And I would have thought the Ministry of Health, I think they've been caught with their pants down. No one could have predicted COVID-19 the way it has happened, but I would have thought the Ministry of Health would have had in their file somewhere a plan for this type of outbreak. They should have had a facility that perhaps, make a container city using the military cabins. I don't know. I just think staying in 4-star hotels and the guests treating the staff like it's a luxury and complaining about meals and getting room service and we get free dry cleaning, and it's extravagant, and I just think who's paying for it basically.
What do you reckon the value of your stay has been there, Tony? So at the end of it, you would have been there 2 weeks?
I worked it out, and I was being realistic with the dry cleaning, the meals, the food. I worked out about 4,500.
Dry cleaning? So you get freebies with the dry cleaning?
You get two vouchers of $25 each, up to 10 items. So you get 2 bags of free dry cleaning. Now, I've probably had 8 garments done, so I'm trying to use the same set of exercise clothes, and I've been washing them in the basin. But what gets me, you know how we all know how to protect ourselves from COVID, washing our hands, cleaning the surfaces. I expected in the rooms, instead of being so luxurious with the meals, the choices, the room service, people are allowed to ring up and order coffees, and that's all very well and good, but it's staff. So I think they should have alcohol wipes in the rooms. We got nothing to wipe our surfaces down, yet it tells us to clean our surfaces regularly. I asked for some cleaning products a few days ago when housekeeping rung. They gave me 1 sachet of this detergent. And
but you can get a cappuccino if you want one.
Yeah, it's bullshit. And there's a man last night walking, an American guy, as I said, walking around in the area where he's not, but no one told him off. I expect it to be harsh, like, hey, mate, get out. So I said to him, get out. And he sort of gave me an abuse, and I'm like, we're not guests. We're here under quarantine types, managed isolation. It's a holiday, basically. People, like a lady, I was watching a Maori family yesterday, and the lady didn't want to wear a mask. And the minute the Navy person went up and said, hey, excuse me, you've got to wear a mask. The last few days, that's obviously been a rule that's changed. And she goes, I can't. I don't want to breathe in my own ear. And I just thought, Jesus Christ. So a compromise was she wore it over her mouth and she left her nose out. So why wasn't she told, no mask, no walk? It's stupid. It's way too soft, way too luxurious, and I'd like to know who's footing the bill.
Well, everybody is. The taxpayers are. So first thing, Tony, just very briefly, would you be prepared to make a contribution to isolation costs, and do you think people should be charged in part?
I worked out what I could afford. I worked out that I would throw in, not much, but $500 towards the food, but I'd be prepared to come down in standard. I'd be prepared to accept, if they said you're vegetarian, you're meat, you're either veggie or you're meat or a vegan, and no choices. But if someone said to me it's $2,000, I would have altered my plans in Australia to wait until the quarantine was over. I chose to come now because I got a job offer. So I thought, but I wouldn't have been in I would have been in the financial position to pay $2,000, but I personally would have waited, and I would have turned the job down and waited till I didn't particularly want to come into isolation, and I wouldn't want to spend $2,000 or $2,500 or $4,000. I'd be happy if they said, like, $500 is a cash donation. I'd like, okay, bang, no problem. But if it was $2,000, I would have changed my plans because I would rather have my $2,000 in the bank.
And that's Tony Foster, who's in isolation in Auckland. There are fears for the mental health of seasonal workers from the Pacific Islands stuck in Hawke's Bay because of the pandemic. More than 1,500 workers are still in the region, and with little paid work and no return date in sight, homesickness is turning into depression and anxiety. But as Anusha Bradley reports, some are finding solace in giving back to the community while they wait to get home.
A song from home providing a little warmth for the soul on what feels like the coldest day of the year so far. These 30 Samoan men are part of a group of 117 that arrived from Putasi village in November to work for Johnny Appleseed in Hastings. They should have gone home nearly 3 months ago, but they're stuck here with only just enough paid work to get by and increasingly without hope of getting back anytime soon. One of them, Witi Langavale, says it's now a waiting game and there's only one question on everyone's lips.
When are we going to come back? As you see, this is the first time I had nearly 6 layers of gloves. It's very hard to manage the cold weather now.
He says not being able to return home is taking its toll on them.
For some of the men already lose hope. They are very stressed, too much pressure. But we managed to talk to them and make them happy, just to be calm, be patient, and pray to God. God will prepare a nice day for us to go back home.
The operations manager at Johnny Appleseed, Len Thompson, says the impact of this uncertainty on the workers' mental health is concerning.
The biggest issue probably facing particularly the leaders is the mental health issue. There's depression, there's anxiety, there's anger, and the problem is there's no day. It's not like they can say, oh, it's another 2 weeks away or whatever. There's no day currently.
With the season over, Johnny Appleseed is only able to offer 20 hours of paid work a week to these workers, which means they haven't yet had to dip into their savings destined for home. With the rest of their time, they've been keeping busy volunteering, with this group planting seedlings in the nursery at the privately owned wildlife park Cape Sanctuary on Cape Kidnappers. The sanctuary's nursery manager, Amy Lister, says their help is gratefully received.
Well, to put it in perspective, I think if we had our normal volunteers and our normal permanent staff doing this work, it was probably about 6 months worth of work. And the boys can get it done in a week, I'd say, the RSE guys. So it's amazing, yeah. And I think it kind of goes both ways. We can provide them with something that's not just sitting at home waiting to be able to get the call from the government to go home, and they are helping us in a huge way.
Witi Langavale says being able to help the community that's hosted them through such a difficult time is lifting morale.
They really like to come out here in the open space and work together, talk, share news, share stories like we are back home. But back in the accommodation where you have 2 in each room, so it's only 2 of you.
The 1,500 RSE workers stranded in Hawke's Bay are being supported by their employers, Hastings District Council, Civil Defence and the Red Cross. The council's also organising regular sports days, get-togethers and meals to help boost spirits. Talks are underway to create an isolation facility in the village of Putasi to help get these men home. But Len Thompson says the recent fiasco at managed isolation facilities in this country has put them on the back foot.
You know, New Zealand's been responsible for 2 major epidemics being exported to Samoa, one of which killed, nearly 30% of them. And so that's been the Spanish flu epidemic, and then last year we had the measles epidemic. So I can appreciate the Samoan government's hesitancy with respect to repatriation.
And while plans are worked out, these men continue to work and sing. This particular song celebrates their district in Samoa, a reminder of home and their families and what awaits them upon their return. In Hastings for Checkpoint, Anusha Bradley.
And time for some of your feedback before we get to the news at 6. We spoke to Tony, who's in managed isolation at the Novotel, and she's concerned it's a little bit too luxurious, and as she puts it, well, some people are taking the mickey. Some of you getting in touch about this. One listener says, I know of a woman who also stayed in managed isolation. She was served far too much food and asked for meals to be stopped. However, they just continued and got wasted as she didn't eat them. Seems like these hotels are rotting the system. Len has got in touch as well and says on the quarantine story, it's the hotels that are taking the mickey. The more food and services they supply to clients, the more money they make. Be very interesting to find out how those contracts work and whether they're a set fee, Len. I think it's an interesting point. Another listener says a container city to house 5,000 plus returnees, though maybe not ideal hotels are the only way to accommodate these people right now. Obviously, there was also the suggestion of using camper vans. And Jan has got in touch too. Jan says, I thought isolation meant staying in your room with food delivered to the door. We are so soft and wasting money everywhere.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Lei ātawa tēnei. The government has stopped funding next year's America's Cup while it investigates claims public funds have been mismanaged by the events arm of Team New Zealand. The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment says no further payments will be made pending the outcome of the process. Amy Williams has more.
The ministry says 3/4 of the $40 million set aside for the event fee has already been paid. The Auckland Council says the claims under investigation do not relate to its $113 million investment and contribution to the America's Cup. Councillors were briefed behind closed doors today. Team New Zealand denies any wrongdoing in the way its events arm has handled public funding. Ko Amy Williams, tēnei.
The National Party leader Todd Muller is adamant there's no bad blood between him and his predecessor as he welcomes Simon Bridges into his shadow cabinet. Mr Bridges will be the opposition's foreign affairs spokesperson, a job he is understood to have wanted after losing the leadership, but for which he was originally passed over. Mr Muller told Checkpoint he and Mr Bridges are on the same page.
I mean, look, clearly I challenged for the leadership. That was robust. But we have a professional relationship. We're side by side in the same city. So, look, we don't need to worry about that. We certainly know how to work together for the good of this country.
Todd Muller, the role of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, was formerly held by Jerry Brownlee. More than 40,000 people have received wage subsidy payouts from more than one employer. Information released to Checkpoint shows 42,200 have been paid by 2 employers, 2,200 by 3 and 364 by 4 or more. However, tax specialist Scott Mason told the programme that even those getting several payouts are unlikely to have profited from the scheme.
At an individual level, there might be people who got $50 more a week than they would have otherwise, simply because there were 2 lots of wage subsidy being paid to them by 2 employers. But that's absolutely in the margins.
The Ministry for Social Development says it is aware of the risk associated with employees being claimed by multiple workplaces, and that is part of its audit program. An Auckland businessman has been sentenced to 6 months community detention for giving unlicensed immigration advice. Between 2015 and 2017, Peter Woodberg advised potential migrants from South Africa to apply for holiday visas in New Zealand but then work here illegally. Mackenzie Smith reports.
Mr Woodberg's business, North Shore Immigration Services, has employed several licensed immigration advisors, but he himself has never held a licence. He pleaded guilty to 3 charges laid by the Immigration Advisors Authority and will also pay $5,600 in reparation to his victims. The Acting Registrar of Immigration Advisors, Simon Van Weigel, says Mr Woodberg took advantage of vulnerable migrants and potentially harmed New Zealand's reputation. Call Mackenzie Smith, tēnei.
A long-time advisor to the Chinese government says Beijing is trying to force the Hong Kong people into submission. The police there have arrested about 370 people following violent clashes with protesters opposed to a new security law imposed by China. 10 of the arrests were made under the new legislation, which allows for punishments of up to life in prison for crimes of secession, collusion, terrorism or subversion. Robert Lawrence Kuhn says the law will be fully enforced.
The more they do that, the more Hong Kong people will start self-censoring, which is the primary object. China does not want to have tanks in the street and soldiers marching. That's not the point.
The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Hong Kong is now just another communist-run city. It's 4 minutes past 6. The coach of the New Zealand women's sevens team, Corey Sweeney, says the country's low coronavirus restrictions will give his team and the Black Ferns an advantage over their opponents ahead of next year's Tokyo Olympics and the Women's Rugby World Cup. He says having players involved in club rugby and the Farah Palmer Cup domestic competition will be hugely beneficial.
Real advantage for us having the ability to play quality rugby in our own country without having to travel. So I think not only are they going to benefit themselves through individual growth, but they get the opportunity to connect with their communities where it all started for them.
Meanwhile, the Highlanders have refreshed their front row for Saturday's Super Rugby Aotearoa Southern derby against the Crusaders in Dunedin. Coach Aaron Major has named a new starting front row of Daniel Leonard-Brown, Liam Coltman and Jeff Thwaites in the wake of the side's last round loss to the Blues. Relegation-threatened West Ham have upset Chelsea 3-2 in English football's Premier League to move 3 points clear of the drop zone. Third-placed Leicester City lost 2-1 to Everton, while stragglers Bournemouth and Norwich both had big losses, going down to Newcastle and Arsenal respectively. And the Supercars round scheduled for Winton near Melbourne later this month is set to be postponed because of Victoria's COVID-19 resurgence. Sydney will now get an extra round. That's the news.
Coming up on 9 to noon tomorrow, claims women are needlessly getting cervical cancer due to an inferior screening system and the failure to widely roll out new technology. Cute and inviting to look at, but what are the risks of smart toys? From Uganda to Auckland, the remarkable story of dancer Elf Daniel's Mivule Basibia Mabingo, plus new music, sport and lots of laughs with Tereda and Pinky Agnew. Join me, Lynn Freeman, and for Catherine Ryan on 9 to noon on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow, northern half of the North Island from Taranaki and Taupo northwards, including Bay of Plenty, mainly fine, a few showers north of Auckland tonight, morning frosts in sheltered places. South Taranaki and Taihape to Kapiti, showers with snow to 800 metres inland, clearing tomorrow morning. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, showers with snow above 700 metres, easing tonight, then clearing tomorrow. Gale or severe gale southerlies slowly easing. Wellington and Waited upper showers clearing tomorrow morning and strong cold southerlies easing. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland fine with morning frosts. North and mid-Canterbury showers becoming confined to Banks Peninsula tonight, fine tomorrow with morning frosts. South Canterbury, Otago, Southland and Fiordland fine with overnight frosts, some severe inland. Scattered rain developing late tomorrow about Fiordland and western parts of Southland and Otago. Chatham Islands showers and strong cold southerlies easing tomorrow. RNZ National. It's 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. It reads like a bad movie script. Allegations of spying, claims of misappropriated funds in Hungarian bank accounts. This afternoon, the government announced it will not make further payments to America's Cup organisers as it investigates claims over the spending of public money. Now, our reporter Nick Trubridge is down at Emirates Team New Zealand headquarters. They have declined to be interviewed tonight, but have released a short statement. It says it supports the government in holding funds until the process is complete and we have closed out all issues. But is this just the latest chapter of controversy in the battle for the oldest sporting trophy on the planet? Joining me now is former America's Cup sailor turned AUT sailing professor Mark Orams. Well, this is sounding a little bit messy, isn't it, Mark? Are you surprised by any of it?
G'day, Lisa. In some ways, I think it's perhaps a surprise that we haven't had some controversy like this for a couple of years. Certainly, there's a long tradition that goes back many, many decades and many campaigns, and it's part of the intrigue of the America's Cup that these sorts of things seem to inevitably arise. As you say, Hungarian bank account spies, or all kinds of other things. It's like some kind of novel.
So what does this mean in practical terms? The withholding of funds by MB until this is all sorted out. Whose money is that? Where was it going? And does it put the event at risk at all?
Yeah, so I think an important thing to understand here is that Emirates Team New Zealand is a separate entity from America's Cup Events, or ACE, as the acronym is. So Emirates Team New Zealand is the sailing syndicate that is the competitor, so the defender of the America's Cup. ACE is the event management organisation, and the money that's been frozen and that's under contest at the moment is the money that has been from MB and also Auckland Council put into ACE to both plan and run the America's Cup event. So that's money for things like the opening ceremony, security, on-water policing, safety on the water, those kinds of things that are associated with running the America's Cup event itself.
So how long before it starts to really bite if that money is not flowing? Does it disrupt preparations? Does it put the timing of the event at risk?
Not hugely at this point, because at this stage what's going on is a lot of planning around what will happen as we come into the summer of 2021. But most of that expenditure will actually happen during the event itself. So those are staff that are employed, for example, the events that are going on, some of the hospitality, other things like that. Those expenses are largely occurred during the event running. So it shouldn't disrupt too much at this particular point in time. But I think it is appropriate that MB has decided that they'll just take a pause on delivering further amounts of that public money into ACE until this issue is sorted out.
We're talking millions and millions here, so even if it doesn't delay the timeline for the event, could this be damaging to public confidence in this event?
Well, I suppose that's something that people will be looking at this and questioning what the heck's going on. And quite rightly, there's a significant amount of our taxpayers' money that's going in to support this event. And so there does need to be appropriate oversight and governance and audits with regard to what's happening with our money that's going into this event. So I think that that's something that the public would welcome, and indeed MB's decision to, at this stage, freeze any further money going to ACE is a recognition of that. However, in the context of what will be an amazing summer for Auckland and New Zealand, and especially in the context post-COVID, the contribution that a successful America's Cup can give to us, not just financially, but I think in terms of just the lift and the engagement in something that puts New Zealand and New Zealand technology on the world map again, is something that we should always remember. It's been an amazing ride, New Zealand's involvement in this event, and it has reflected greatly on our country and enhanced our reputation internationally.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is Professor Mark Orams, a former America's Cup sailor turned AUT professor. National leader Todd Muller has brought Simon Bridges back into the fold, giving him the foreign affairs portfolio he was after. However, he's kept him low in the party rankings. Mr Muller announced a minor reshuffle today, prompted by the retirement of Paula Bennett. Shane Reti has been bumped up the list, taking over Paula Bennett's number 13 ranking and a new associate drug reform portfolio. Mr Bridges is assuming Dr Reti's number 17 spot on the list and taking foreign affairs off Jerry Brownlee. Have you kept up with all of that? The reshuffle means there is still just 2 Māori MPs in the top 20 and no non-Pākehā on the front bench. Here's political reporter Yvette McCullough.
6 weeks into the job, and Mr Muller was back in front of media, announcing another reshuffle and having to sing the praises of the man he rolled as leader.
He's a fantastic MP and he's a fantastic contributor to our caucus, and I've recognised that today by giving him a Foreign Affairs role, which is a significant role.
Although he's been given a top portfolio, Mr Bridges hasn't been given a top ranking, barely sneaking into the top 20. Mr Muller always said there would be a space for him in a shadow cabinet. Simon Bridges made no secret of the fact he wanted Foreign Affairs when he was ousted as leader, but he was overlooked for Jerry Brownlee. Mr Muller says that was then, this is now.
I made a decision at the time that I would stay with what I have, and it's my judgment actually now, many weeks on, that this actually is an opportunity to provide Simon with the portfolio that he would like, a reflection of the contribution that he has made as a former National Party leader, the status that he has in our party and the status of that portfolio.
Deputy Leader Nikki Kaye says Mr Brownlee understands the decision and his focus is on making sure National wins the election. She says Mr Bridges did not strong-arm her and Mr Muller, and this isn't a case of the leadership appeasing Mr Bridges now to keep him happy.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think the situation here is we want to have the best possible team to fight an election. Todd had already signalled that he was going to be in the cabinet if we're in government. Simon wanted that portfolio, but he's also very capable for that portfolio.
Mr Muller is adamant that his caucus is united and he's confident he'll be able to work well with Mr Bridges.
No, we've got a very professional relationship, not a problem there at all.
Is it a good relationship?
Yes, it's absolutely fine.
Mr Muller says he's looking forward to seeing Mr Bridges go head-to-head with Winston Peters.
Well, it's always fun to watch when those two go head-to-head and on issues relating to New Zealand's place in the world. I think it'll even be more so.
But the Foreign Affairs Minister did not offer a ringing endorsement when asked if he thought Mr Bridges would be a formidable opponent.
Well, I was actually astonished to see that it's been demoted down to 17 and then they've chosen him. Well, I don't want a duel of wits with an unarmed opponent. I'm looking forward to it.
Simon Bridges did not respond to RNZ's request for comment today. While this reshuffle may solve his Mr Bridges problem, it doesn't solve Mr Muller's diversity problem. He came under fire in his first week as leader for not having any non-Pākehā on his front bench. But he says just 11 weeks out from the election, this was always going to be just a small change, purely focused on the vacancy left by Mrs Bennett. And he's standing by the diversity of his shadow cabinet as a whole.
I look at it through the lens of talent and capability, and the net effect of that is a diverse and very strong shadow cabinet, and indeed a very diverse and very strong 55.
Māori Party founder Dame Tariana Turia says this is a lost opportunity and Dr Reti should have been put on the front bench.
Well, I would understand it if nobody was competent enough, but you have people like Shane Reti, a doctor of many years, a fabulous performer in the community, but also here in Parliament. He should be in the top 10.
Dame Tariana says it's incredibly disappointing that Mr Muller hasn't responded to the heavy criticism.
It was time for change, time for people to have respect for all people in this country, and he's chosen to ignore it.
The other tweaks to the lineup announced today see Nikki Kaye taking up the women's spokesperson role and Amy Adams taking the lead on drug reform. Campaign manager Jerry Brownlee, who remains at number 6 despite giving up his foreign affairs portfolio, did not return RNZ's calls. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Yvette McCullough.
It is almost 17 minutes past 6. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. So David Clark is out and Chris Hipkins is in. The new Health Minister is also the Minister of Education and State Services, the Leader of the House, and the Minister responsible for ministerial services. I spoke to Chris Hipkins a little earlier and asked if this is a major career boost for him or a complete nightmare.
Oh, look, I'm always up for a challenge. I think there's no doubt that health is a big role, and I've got a big role with education, but I think it's a really important job, clearly in the context of COVID-19. We've got a lot of work ahead of us.
Can you do both jobs justice?
Yeah, I think I can. Obviously, I don't think I could do that forever, but I certainly think for the next 3 months I can give both of those portfolios the attention that they need.
So, well, when the Prime Minister raised this with you, did you think about turning it down? Did you turn it down?
Oh, look, we had a good, honest conversation about it. Obviously, I'll need some support in the role from associate ministers and from staff, and I'm confident that I'll be able to get all of the support that I need to be able to do the job effectively.
When you say you had a good, honest conversation with her, I mean, what did that involve? Were you a reluctant starter? Was it a surprise to you?
No, I mean, we had a good, honest conversation about the challenges that are ahead. Obviously, COVID-19 has thrown into sharp relief some of the pressure that our health system is under, and so we had a conversation about that and some of the things that need to happen there. Obviously, there have been some shortcomings in recent months. I think my colleague, Dr. Megan Woods, has already got on top of the issues around the border and around managed isolation, and I'm very confident in the work she's doing there. There's still some work to be done around testing and contact tracing, and I'm looking forward to rolling my sleeves up and getting into that. And then, of course, there are the wider challenges in the health portfolio. We've got the Heather Simpson review, which now sits with the government. We need to work our way through that and make sure that we've got a good, solid government response to that.
When did you have the conversation with the Prime Minister? When did she say she wanted you to take this portfolio?
I think the Prime Minister has said, these conversations have been ongoing over the last week or so. I probably first had the conversation with her about a week ago when she was having conversations with Dr. Clark. I think everybody at that point was approaching things with an open mind, and we were looking at a variety of different options at that time. Dr. Clark was considering his own future and has taken some time to reflect on that.
Which one of these two big portfolios that you've got, health and education, which one's the top priority?
Look, they're both a top priority. I'm absolutely
but you're not going to be able
to give them. Both.
You're not going to be able to give them equal time and equal consideration. So, where are your priorities going to lie? Health or education?
Look, there is no question there are some immediate issues in health that I'm going to have to devote some time to. I'm very confident that we've got education into a good space. There are a number of projects now that are ongoing where the work is being done, where the policy work and the implementation work that I needed to do as a minister has been done, and those things are now underway. Of course, I want to keep an eye on those and make sure that we continue to make progress there. So I'm confident that I can keep a good watching overview over what's happening in education whilst also helping to address some of the challenges that we're facing in health.
But health's the top job?
No, look, I wouldn't say that because education is obviously something that I'm very passionate about as well. So we
but something's got to give, though, doesn't it, Minister? Something's got to give. We've got a pandemic. The Prime Minister keeps telling us it's not over. In fact, it's getting worse offshore. It's a big job to deal with that. You're not going to be able to give those portfolios equal weight and attention, are you? So one's got to come first. Which is it?
Yeah, no, look, I wouldn't characterise it like that. I think it is actually possible to do both jobs. Like I said, I don't think it would necessarily be sustainable over many years, but I think in the 3 months in the run-up to an election, I think it's certainly doable.
So you've got, 79 days to the election. What are you going to do in that time in health, or are you just going to stand still? Are you just the space holder?
No, I think, as I said, the first priority is the COVID-19 response. So I think that we've got to look very closely at how that's going. We've got to look at any areas where we think we can sharpen that response up, and that's first order of business. We've then got the Heather Simpson review, which we have to look at carefully and make sure that we've got a good, solid government response to that.
Have you read that yet, the Heather Simpson review?
As the Minister of the Cabinet, I've certainly read the papers that have come to Cabinet on that.
But you haven't read the review yet?
I haven't yet had a chance to read through the entirety of the review, but I'll certainly do that over the weekend. Then, of course, there's some issues around health spending as well. So there's a big capital investment spend program going on in health, as there is in education. We want to make sure that those big capital programs stay on track and that we're shifting that money out the door. That's actually a really important part of our economic recovery, making sure that those capital investments are delivering the jobs that we want them to. So I'll be monitoring that very closely.
Were you the first choice of the Prime Minister for this job?
Look, that's something you'd need to ask the Prime Minister.
Do you know if you were the first choice or not? Or had she gone to someone else who said, no way, no thanks, health?
I'm certainly not aware that she's asked anybody else to take the role on. When she asked me if I would consider doing it, we had a good conversation about it. In the end, I said, yes, I think I would be willing to take the job on.
Do you want the job permanently after the election if you're still in government?
Look, that's a question for another day. My focus is on what's
Why not?
What's going to happen
let's get
in the
to it now. Well, let's get to it now. I mean, if you're keen on it and it's something you wanted to take on, are you committed to the point that you would want to be the Health Minister after the election if the opportunity arises?
Oh, look, I'm very happy to continue to serve in whatever role the Prime Minister asks me to if we're forming the government after the next election.
How are you different from David Clark?
Look, David Clark is a very good friend of mine, and I'm focused on looking forward. I don't want to go backwards over the territory that's been canvassed in recent weeks. I know this has been a really tough decision for him. He's got my full support. I think what he's done is very honourable. We are different people. We've got different operating styles, but I think David has made a really tough call, and I just really want to acknowledge him and how difficult that would have been for him.
Are you happy with everything in terms of the way the ministry is running at the moment?
Oh, look, every minister has a different operating style, and when there's a change of minister, regardless of what portfolio it is, there's always a period of adaptation for the public servants who are working with that minister, and no doubt that will happen now with health as well.
Have you had the briefing for the incoming minister yet?
We had some briefing because I had question time today. I had to answer my first two questions as Minister of Health, so I needed to be briefed on the topics that I was being questioned on there. But we'll get into more detailed briefings in the coming days.
Have they identified with you any urgent things that need your immediate attention?
Yeah, well, they identified two urgent issues with me today, and they were issues that I was being questioned on in the House. So they clearly made it to the top of the priority list. But in terms
of action, I mean, Minister, have they come to you and said, look, you're the Minister now, these are the two top things that you need to get done in the next couple of days?
Look, we're going to get into much greater detail into the portfolio. Obviously, I've got some questions for them around contact tracing and around the testing regime around COVID-19, which I've got, those are questions that I have for them. And then we'll get into other issues as they arise.
You say that you started having talks with the Prime Minister over about a week, right? So when exactly did she give you the job?
We confirmed that yesterday.
What time?
Look, I wouldn't know the exact time. It was sometime yesterday.
And so when did your briefing start? When was the first briefing you had on the health portfolio?
At 1 o'clock this afternoon.
That was your very first one?
It was indeed, yep.
And that is the new Health Minister, Chris Hipkins. More bones are expected to get greater protection under new proposals announced today. The government is proposing to create regulations under the Wildlife Act to ban the sale of moa bones and other remains of extinct species. Since 2010, there has been more than 350 cases of moa bones and eggshells being put up for sale, many from protected sites. Jonathan Mitchell reports.
In the basement of Te Papu's Natural History Store in central Wellington, there's a maze of wooden boxes, shelves and cabinets that contain the bones and skeletons of New Zealand's past, including thousands of individual moa bones. Colin Miskelly is a curator and, carefully wearing gloves, picked up a moa bone that's thousands of years old, but is so clean it could pass for something found recently.
We chose that specimen to show you today for a couple of reasons, and one is that very one. You look at it and you think, that looks so fresh it could almost be yesterday. But the other one is a more pragmatic museum point of view, is that whenever you take these bones out of the boxes and move them around, and even if they're being handled, which we're not doing at the moment, there's a risk that they're going to get bumped and knocked around. And these particular bones from Pyramid Valley are quite robust, whereas a lot of our other bones are very, very fragile because other sites are not so. The bones are not as well preserved.
The Conservation Minister, Eugenie Sage, also donned gloves and picked up the bone. She says the country has lost far too many native species and selling them needs to stop.
These bones are often found in swamps or in caves, networks of caves on the west coast in Golden Bay, and people go there to get the profit from selling them, steal them, even though that is an offence, but it's very hard to enforce. Even if they're photographs, it's very hard to enforce it in a court to prove that they actually came from a particular site. So what we're doing is proposing regulations, seeking public comment to completely ban the sale in the remains of extinct species such as moa bones.
She's launched a discussion document today to get feedback, adding there would be exemptions, including trading ancient Māori artefacts and antique jewellery. Te Papu's Kaihotu Māori co-leader, Arapata Hakiwai, says iwi have a close connection with moa and will respond to the proposals.
One of my iwi there, it's in our waiata, one of our waiata tangi, which reference, I suppose, in terms of the qualities of the moa. And the fact that, our ancestors made a range of taonga there, from necklaces to awls and different taonga that made it, is a way of actually showing respect and venerating those close connections.
Colin Miskelly has a simple message for those looking to make a quick buck.
So if they have got those bones because they cherish them and they like owning them, nothing has changed. But if they've got them because they want to make a profit, sorry, it's going to stop.
Submissions on the proposals are open until late September. For Checkpoint, Court Jonathan Mitchell, Tēnei.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has taken a big step towards being president for life. Voters have overwhelmingly approved constitutional changes, the most crucial of which would reset the term limits given to Mr. Putin, giving Mr. Putin another 16 years in power. One of the most vocal opponents has already dismissed the results as a huge lie. Opponents point out there's been no independent scrutiny of the vote, and huge prize draws were announced to entice people to vote, with the chance of winning shopping vouchers, a new car or a new flat. The BBC's Sarah Rainsford has this report.
This voter ticked a firm yes to Vladimir Putin's giant package of constitutional reforms. More than 200 amendments in total, covering everything from keeping hold of Crimea to animal rights. But all of that was colourful, distracting wrapping for the one key reform for the Kremlin. Article 81 has now been changed so that Mr. Putin could run twice more for president. Why change the captain of a ship if he's steering the right course? This man reasoned at a Moscow polling station. But younger voters felt very differently.
I believe that it's impossible to be a president of a modern country more than 30 years, and we vote strongly against this.
It's ridiculous, and we can't support that.
Critics have condemned this vote as a sham and a power grab. Campaigning against the amendments was banned. The ballot was also stretched over a week because of the coronavirus risk, making independent monitoring almost impossible. But for the Kremlin, this resounding win lends popular legitimacy to an audacious act, allowing Mr. Putin to extend his time in the Kremlin until 2036.
And that was Sarah Rainsford reporting. Thanks for joining us today. We enjoyed your company and all your feedback. Our news team will keep you up to date overnight. And don't forget, Indira Stewart and the team from First Up will be with you first thing tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. We'll catch you again tomorrow night.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The government has suspended further funding of the America's Cup while it investigates claims that Team New Zealand's events arm mismanaged public funds. The Electoral Commission is destroying millions of brochures on the end-of-life choice referendum after one item was accidentally printed in bold. 2 more robots recovered from the Pike River Mine access tunnel this week will be examined by the police forensics team. And an Auckland businessman has been sentenced to community detention for advising potential migrants to apply for holiday visas and then work here illegally. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7 o'clock.
Tonight on Nights, Teina Moetara with his Māori perspective on art. This evening, Matariki and its connection to COVID. Lien Huang is on the line from Vietnam. Alison Balance speaks to this year's Prime Minister Science Prize winners. And our native fish geek Stella McQueen tells us